ECPR Wildenmann Prize is awarded annually to a scholar before PhD or within 5 years of receiving their PhD in recognition of an outstanding paper presented at the joint sessions of workshops. And this can also be a co-authored paper, of course. The prize is named after Rudolf Wildenmann, a path-breaking German political scientist. Wildenmann is regarded as one of the pioneers of empirical election research and a designer of the social science infrastructure in Germany and in Europe more broadly. Wildenmann became known to the broad public through his work on setting up the Mannheim Research Group elections at the University of Mannheim and his collaborations on the Politbarometer. The Wildenmann Prize is awarded by a jury consisting of members of the ECPR Executive Committee and editors of the ECPR journals once a year. And in 2023, the jury consists of Simona Guerre of the University of Surrey. She is the editor of the open science journal Political Research Exchange. Marina Costolobo of the University of Lisbon. She is the editor of the European Political Science Review. Emiliano Grossman of Sciences Po Paris, and he is the editor, co-editor of the European Journal of Political Research. We have Halvard Lyra of the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs as an associate editor of the European Journal of International Relations, and myself, Sabine Saurugger of Sciences Po Grenoble. I'm the chair of the prize. I have the honor to be the chair of the prize, and I'm member of the ECPR Executive Committee. The 2023 Wildenmann Prize is awarded to Kathleen Brown, and her paper called IMF Survival Instincts, Risk Exposure and the Design of Loan Programs looks at one specific aspect of international organizations' behavior, the attribution of loans. She asks why international financial organizations attribute loans the way they do. In other words, how do international organizations, international financial organizations, decide which amount of funding goes to whom? Despite an international system that seems increasingly dominated by power games among states and transnational non-state actors, international organizations remain a central actor in international affairs. In recent studies, scholars have opened up the black box of international organizations even more systematically than before, questioning their presumed apolitical nature and analyzing the transformation of the internal paradigms on which their decisions are based. In other words, international organizations have become a widely studied phenomenon, not only by international relations scholars, but by administrative studies, policy sciences, and political science in general. In Kathleen Brown's paper, the jury particularly appreciated the historical breadth and the methodological rigor, as well as the systematic presentation of the results. Kathleen challenges the traditional literature by testing the attribution of IMF loans to 123 countries across 30 years. She shows the causal relationship between rising risk exposure of the IMF and the impact on countries and global governance. As it is, as one jury member underlined, a timeless and timely article at the same time. The study opens important questions which will have further repercussions for the field of international studies and for political science more generally. International political economy combined with administrative studies and international relations in general has proven a fertile approach to answer broad questions and giving important answers, thus mirroring the richness of the plurality of political science subdisciplines, as we're very, very happy and honored to do so in ECPR. In the name of the Rudolf Wildenmann Prize jury, I would like to congratulate Kathleen for her outstanding paper.
My name is Svanhildur Thorvaldsdottir, and I'm a lecturer in political science and public administration at the University of Iceland. Together with my colleague, Mirko Heinzel, a research fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, I organized and conducted the workshop where Kathleen Brown presented her award-winning paper. I want to tell you a little bit about the background of the workshop itself, as well as the reason we found Katie's paper worthy of nomination. The workshop that Mirko and I organized was entitled Resourcing International Organizations, and we sought to explore recent trends in the financing and the impact that these trends are having on both IOs themselves and also on our collective ability to solve global problems. IOs recognize pressure on their resources as one of the biggest threats to their mandates and try to increase their finances. They've done so by expanding their resource base beyond member states and accepting contributions from the private sector, private foundations, and individuals. However, such expansions could affect not only the resources that IOs have at their disposal, but also the distribution of power among principals and the autonomy of IOs from particular interests. Mirko and I have both been working on financing of international organizations for several years. And in organizing this workshop, we wanted to try to bring together scholars interested in understanding the causes and consequences of IO resourcing, as well as their implications for the future of IO autonomy and effectiveness in managing global challenges. We especially sought to bring together a diverse group of scholars, and especially younger scholars who often bring the most innovative ideas to the table. So last April, we met in Toulouse for an intense 3 days of discussion. And I think I actually speak for everyone present when I say that this was one of the most rewarding conference experiences we have had. Kathleen presented her paper on the second day, and I want to say a few words about why it stood out to us in the end, and we decided to submit it for the Rudolf Wildenmann Prize. The paper, entitled IMF Survival Instincts, Risk Exposure, and the Design of Loan Programs, really combines everything that you want to see in a research paper. It has a novel argument, rigorous empirical analysis, timeliness, broader implications, and exceptional writing. In sum, it's an outstanding piece of scholarship. The paper presents a novel argument on the influence of IMF risk exposure on decision-making processes within the organization. That is to say, when existing IMF borrowers are at risk of default, the IMF becomes more and more strict with new borrowers. This argument challenges prevailing notions in the literature by going beyond the predominant focus on politics, technocratic motives, and bureaucratic ideology. That's really been the focus of previous studies. To test this argument, the paper employs a rigorous methodology using data from 589 IMF loans to 123 countries between 1985 and 2015. And through its novel argument and careful empirical analysis, the paper also contributes to broader debates on global governance institutions by emphasizing the influence of organizational environments, particularly financial markets, on decision-making processes within these institutions. In addition to its academic significance, the paper is timely and policy relevant. Experts predict unprecedented levels of debt crises for low and middle income countries in the coming years. These developments will likely lead to rising risk exposure of the IMF, and the findings of the paper highlight the worrying consequences that this risk exposure could have for countries that seek help from the IMF as a lender of last resort. Congratulations, Katie, on a prize well-deserved.
Hello, my name is Kathleen Brown, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Institute of Political Science at Leiden University, where I specialize in international political economy. My broader work focuses on the politics of sovereign debt, as well as the role that international organizations play in government's financial statecraft. I'm so honored to receive the Rudolf Wildenmann Prize for this piece, and I'd like to thank the members of the jury for their careful consideration, as well as to thank Mirko Heinzel and Svanhildur Thorvaldsdottir for their nomination. Mirko and Svanhildur put such an enormous amount of work into organizing the ECPR Joint Sessions Workshop on resourcing international organizations, and they both provided me with really valuable feedback on this paper, so I'm particularly grateful to them for their support. The idea for this paper came through procrastination, specifically when I was killing time on Twitter like a good academic. In the summer of 2022, Pakistan was experiencing devastating floods that caused nearly $15 billion worth of damage, and at the same time was experiencing a fiscal crisis, and so approached the International Monetary Fund for emergency funding assistance. And initially, the IMF refused, and then offered a loan only if the government could fulfill a set of very strict fiscal conditions. And so on Twitter that summer, I started to see some really surprised responses from political commentators and economists alike who pointed out that it was really unusual for the IMF to refuse funding to a country so clearly suffering from the consequences of an exogenous shock. And part of Pakistan's economic crisis may well have been caused by past policy choices, but the immediate emergency and the need for crisis funding was caused by a natural disaster, not by government mismanagement. And essentially, many were puzzled why the IMF was choosing to play hardball now with this particular borrower when the Pakistani government and economy were already at their breaking point. And this got me thinking about the drivers of IMF strategy as an international organization. There's a very rich IPE literature on IMF lending behavior, and in particular, what determines the deal that a crisis-hit government can get from the fund. However, most of this focus is on the characteristics of the individual borrower, for example, arguing that governments get larger or more lenient loans if they have certain risk characteristics, like integration in the global economy or a close relationship with the United States. And with this piece, I wanted to shift focus away from the individual government and look instead at how the IMF may act to serve its own interests for reasons that are unrelated to the circumstances of a borrower. And in this paper, I theorize that the fund has a strong internal bureaucratic interest in its own survival and a prominent position at the forefront of the global economy. And so to survive, the IMF needs to protect its balance sheet and to ensure that it has enough funds not only to serve as the global lender of last resort, but also to grow and thrive as an organization. And this means that when lending to a government in distress, the fund not only considers that government's individual risk of default, but also the risk of default across the organization's entire lending portfolio. So I argue that when the IMF is exposed to particularly high risk, it offers stricter loans to a new borrower, regardless of that government's own credit situation. Linking this back to the Pakistan case, perhaps the IMF was playing hardball here because the organization was exposed to very high default risks from other borrowers, and Pakistan was simply caught in that crossfire. So in this paper, I test the expectation across 589 individual IMF loans, and I build an original measure of IMF risk exposure using country credit risk ratings, which tracks how much default risk the IMF is exposed to within any one given year. Holding an individual borrowing government's own risk rating constant, high risk exposure across the IMF's entire portfolio is associated with smaller loans, more numerous policy conditions, and policy conditions that constrain a larger number of policy areas. So the IMF becomes more involved in a borrower's fiscal policy and places tighter constraints on public spending. When the IMF is concerned that it will experience a default anywhere in its portfolio, which would have massive ramifications for its balance sheet and for its future solvency, it becomes more risk averse, and new borrowers in distress have a lot more trouble accessing emergency funds. The Joint Sessions Workshop was really the perfect place to present this paper for the first time, because it brought together diverse scholars from various corners of political science that I hadn't necessarily interacted with before, all of whom had very different perspectives on the role of international organizations in the international system. And based on the feedback I received at this workshop, I've really expanded this project to examine other ways that the IMF responds to systemic risk, as well as to study the impact of that risk adjustment on social outcomes in countries that are in fiscal distress. This fits into some other work that I have that looks at how governments in the global south in particular respond to fiscal crises. In a paper that was recently published in the Review of International Organizations, I study how governments hide a portion of their sovereign debt to avoid punishment from IOs like the IMF and the World Bank. I'm also currently working on a piece that examines how austerity policies, including those that are mandated by the International Monetary Fund, encourage tax evasion and can also erode state capacity. It's a real honor to receive this prize for a piece of a growing research agenda that's brand new to me. And I very much look forward to sharing this work and future work with the ECPR community.
Kathleen's paper illustrates the breadth and pluralism of political science research conducted at ECPR member organizations. And I just love Kathleen's explanation how she came about to work on this subject. In the name of the ECPR Wildenmann Prize jury, I would like to congratulate Kathleen again and say how much we look forward to her future research.